evening, ladies and gentlemen, here at BRLSI, and good evening to others who are watching on their screens at home. And to that last category of people at home, I'd ask you to make sure that you're muted so that everything goes smoothly for everyone. This is a talk generally interesting to many members of the BRLSI, but it's actually been arranged through the Science and Medicine group. I'm standing in tonight to introduce our speaker, who is Dr. James Costa. And oh yes, and I'm also, I should also remind you that in the event of a fire breaking out here, you need to go out of the door very quickly and reassemble somewhere outside. It's as simple as that. Anyway, welcome to everybody, and welcome in particular to James Costa, our speaker. And Dr. Costa is an entomologist like me, and he's an evolutionary biologist as well. And his scientific research has been focused on insect social evolution and most recently on invasive insects and conservation. But as well as these regular scientific interests, of which obviously I approve very greatly, he's also published extensively on the history of evolution, on Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverers of evolution by natural selection. And for that work, he's been awarded the Alfred Russel Wallace Medal of the Wallace Memorial Fund and the Stephen Jay Gould Prize of the Society for the Study of Evolution. So you can tell that he's pretty good. And we're very lucky that we managed to persuade him to come here and speak, particularly as it's quite a long way. James actually comes from the Highlands biological station in North Carolina in the USA, but he's here in the USA and he agreed to come and talk to us, so that we're very lucky. Jim's written a number of books, which include The Annotated Origin. He wrote another one called Wallace, Darwin and the Origin of Speakers. These both published by Harvard University Press. He wrote Darwin's Backyard, How Small Experiments Lead to Big Theory. And most recently, he's written this book. It's called Radical by Nature, The Revolutionary Life of Alfred Russel Wallace, and it's published by Princeton University Press. And I do believe that there are some copies of this book at Mr. B's bookshop, should you want to rush out and buy one. If you do that, you could come back tomorrow afternoon and Jim might sign it. Let's see. Anyway, James Costa is a trustee of the Charles Darwin Trust, and he's held fellowships at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. He had a sabbatical fellowship at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and also the Lou Esther T. Mertz Library of the New York Botanical Garden, and also he's held a fellowship at the Center for Advanced Study at the University of Hamburg. So he gets around a bit, and he's going to talk to us tonight about the revolutionary life of Alfred Russel Wallace. So Jim, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Stuart, for that very nice introduction. And thanks to all of you for being here. I'm very grateful for this invitation to come and speak to you all about one of my favorite subjects on a wonderful occasion, this year being the celebration of the bicentennial of Alfred Russel Wallace's birth. And so my book, Radical by Nature, was really written as an homage of sorts to really help kind of update and reach out to a broad readership, kind of giving people a sense of the remarkable depth and breadth of thought and explorations and discovery and activism by this remarkable individual, Alfred Russel Wallace. And it's a special pleasure to be here in this beautiful space, in this august institution. I think that this institution is 1 year younger than Wallace, right? It says your 199th year. All right. Well, yeah, it really is a pleasure to be here. And in thinking about how I would like to share my perspectives on Wallace with you, an approach that I'll take is not, I will not give sort of just a typical straight on, linear biography, but rather I want to use the time that we have to explore Wallace from different points of view. And my subtitle here is Sketch of a Life in Borders and Boundaries, Lines and Limits, Fringes and Frontiers. What do I mean by that? And how does that sort of influence my approach? Uh-oh, I'm trying to get my slide advancer to work. It may not, I may have to do this manually. I'm not sure. I wanted to give you a sense of, for so many of us who are biologists, perhaps especially, we may have heard of Wallace through what is known as the Wallace Line. And of course, as a biologist, I early on learned about the so-called Wallace Line that delineates the great kind of Indo-Malayan and Australasian faunas in Southeast Asia. And but this became something of a metaphor for me. I began to think about Wallace and his multitudinous interests and activities and travels and discoveries and his activism. And I began to think about him and really the many lines that we can use to understand the life, the times of Alfred Russel Wallace. And I want to perhaps use this as a device really in introducing you to Wallace. And I'll come back to the Wallace Line, and I'm afraid I'm going to have to maybe advance my slides manually. I cannot get my advancer to work, although if I plan B here, no, I'm going to have to, sorry, I'm going to have to do this manually, yeah, unfortunately. So we're going to think about Wallace's life in terms of lines and borders and boundaries. And these will be sort of lines, literal and metaphorical, and lines and borders and boundaries and frontiers that he, sometimes crossed or transgressed, as the case may be. And maybe it does start at the beginning in the sense that I found it resonant that if we think about the place of Wallace's birth in the village of Usk in South Wales, in Monmouthshire, I thought it was resonant that actually he's born in a borderland, because Monmouthshire was of a sort of uncertain placement for centuries, sometimes considered part of England, sometimes in Wales. I believe the border wasn't really firmly set until the 1970s, when it was firmly set within South Wales. But it's interesting to think about Wallace as kind of, having grown up in a kind of a middle class, but rather impoverished English family that had relocated to rural Wales. He's sort of a stranger in a strange land in some ways. And he's living in this kind of interesting borderland. And I thought it was interesting too, to consider the physical geography of the landscape of his birth. And I thought, this is remarkable actually to realize that Wallace was not only born in a political borderland, he was born atop a geological fault. This is very interesting. He's born atop the Flambatic Fault. And you can see I have this interesting geological formation circled here. This is on one edge of a geological formation that is known to geologists as the Usk Inlier. And on the diagram you see at lower right here, you get a sense of the subsurface structure. This is essentially an anticline, a kind of compressed, arched set of strata that erode. The different rocks of the strata erode at different rates. And at the surface, it kind of leaves kind of these concentric patterns. And you can see that in the place of Wallace's birth, Kensington Cottage, right? It is that is the building in the center of this photograph, kind of backed up against this very steep bank. That very steep bank is in fact a Silurian outcropping as part of that great anticlinal structure. So here Wallace is born really in a borderland twice over, both political but also geological. Of course, very, very young, and I'm not suggesting that he's profoundly, knows anything about this, but I found it personally resonant to think about him as as a very, very young child, kind of being born in this interesting area. The geology of that very steep bank is very, very different from the geology just across the River Usk, right here on the right side of this photograph. And Wallace does recount hunting for fossils and such on that bank. Anyway, rather resonant, I think, a borderland twice over. And it's also resonant, I think, to think about Wallace, if we're going to think about him in terms of lines and borders and boundaries. Consider this, consider that as a young man, first as an apprentice and then professionally, Wallace was a surveyor, right? He trained as an apprentice surveyor, an apprentice builder. And for some years, 1837 to 43, and then after a 1-year hiatus, which I'll say something about, comes back to really take over his eldest brother's business after his brother's death, 1845 to 1847, working as a surveyor at a time when there's an awful lot of survey work to be done, connected with both the commutation of tithes and also the enclosure laws. So a great need for surveyors to begin to survey of what was formerly considered to be common lands. And so he's drawing lines for a living. And this is, for example, a couple of the maps that Alfred Russel Wallace produced with his partner, David Reese. And you see this would be a typical, in the upper left here, this would be a typical newspaper ad, kind of advertising that they produced a map, and that now there will be a public comment period. They're going to be available for questions. What Wallace didn't realize at the time was many saw this as a great injustice, that the rural South Wales farmers and other people were being dispossessed of their land. And that was something that Wallace didn't realize at the time. He's really playing a role in this. But then later, I thought it was interesting to think that although he spent time literally drawing lines as part of the enclosure movement, he then acted to try to erase those lines later. So we see Wallace in his engagement with lines in various ways. If I can possibly get that to advance for us. Here we go. This cartoon is sort of depicting the Rebecca Rioters, the Welsh rioters. And these were men, but also women, but often men dressed as women, the Rebecca Rioters in Wales, especially kind of rioting against, what they saw as very unjust treatment by the government. Later on in life, much later in life, Wallace becomes an avowed socialist, and he campaigns mightily for land nationalization and looking to undo the evils that he came to realize were inherent in enclosure and such. So how does he come to this view? Well, early on, Wallace is influenced by a fellow Welshman, a born Welshman, Robert Owen, the great reformer, who he had occasion to hear speak once in London. And Owen was the great philanthropic reformer who had really grand experimental projects, experimental communities and cooperative living, such as New Lanark in Scotland and New Harmony, Indiana in the United States. These would be experimental communities, and all within the aim of social improvement, trying to improve the lot of the worker, especially, and the way in which people functioned in society, and trying to remove stratification in society. So Wallace is profoundly influenced by Owen, and I've maintained, and others have as well, that he is a lifelong kind of Owenite socialist. And here are the seeds of his socialism planted very, very early, and much later in life. This actually coincides with his science in interesting ways, which I hope to get to a bit later. These are a couple of Wallace's later books, Land Nationalization, The Revolt of Democracy. It gives you a sense of, these are just a couple of his many books. He published some 23 or so books. So we in the biological sciences maybe know Wallace through the lens of the sciences and his contributions to evolutionary biology, biogeography, but he has this whole other interesting life as a social advocate, working for social justice. I'm interested in labor reform, interested in land reform and other causes. So that's another kind of example of Wallace's lines. And we kind of think about that. If you think about his ability to move in that way and campaign in those ways, there's another kind of line that he's crossing, and that is really a social line, the line of social class almost. You know, here we have a young man who left school really at age 14, so very little formal education, largely self-taught, availing himself of the free libraries of the mechanics institutes, the free lectures, and going to lectures like those of Owen in London, for example. He would attend talks of various kinds at the so-called infidels halls, you know, where the likes of the Owenite socialists would hold forth. And so we have him kind of, on the one hand, very much a self-taught and autodidact working man, but then he kind of breaks through that barrier and he emerges by towards the end of this century with you know the greatest of kudos and accolades and honors. You know, he emerges as certainly one of the most famous of the Victorian naturalists, celebrated for, you know, his many achievements, you know, honorary degrees, medals, special awards, for example, the Order of Merit, the highest honor that can be bestowed by the crown to civilians. So, you know, he's achieving great heights. He's invited to the White House when he visits the United States in the mid 1880s. So we have him kind of coming from very humble origins and then achieving these great heights. But it's interesting to note, always very uneasily. He's very uneasy with that kind of fame and polite society. And so let's see if I can get this to advance. Here we go. So I also consider him to be a very reluctant honoree, you know, and this is one wonderful example of that. In 1893, Wallace was finally elected to the Royal Society. And, you know, of course, many commentators noted that someone of his eminence really should have been elected a long time ago. And so here we have a letter to the editor of the Times written by George Darwin, so Charles Darwin's son George, the astronomer, who basically is sort of coming to the defense of the Royal Society and saying, look, you know, it's only just to the Royal Society to state that it's notorious. Mr. Wallace would have been elected at any time within the last 35 years if he ever allowed himself to be nominated, you know. And that was so typical of Wallace, to refuse nominations. He turned down several honorary degrees, including from the University of Cambridge. So he just is very, you know, broke through that social barrier, but very uneasy with, you know, kind of moving in those social circles. You know, he's very much a man of the people, after all. So I thought that's quite interesting. And then, of course, you know, another kind of line we can think about, maybe more literal lines, when we think about Wallace and his travels, his explorations, would be the literal lines of latitude and longitude that he crosses. And here he is, the young autodidact that sets off on voyages of exploration and discovery, first spending 4 years in South America, later 8 years in Southeast Asia, in largely modern day Indonesia. And so I think about him voyaging physically, yes, but also voyaging mentally, right? Voyages of the mind. Here we have, again, the self-taught Wallace, who, you know, has his great aspirations. And I find this truly remarkable about him. Remember, for someone of his standing, right, with very, very little, precious little formal education, deeply interested, curious about the natural world and social institutions, you have a sense, there's a very good record of the sorts of things that he is reading, that he's very interested in. And they would include, for example, you know, some of the great naturalists of the day. He's deeply influenced by the great Alexander von Humboldt and his personal narrative of his travels in the late 1790s into the early 1800s in South America. Of course, Charles Lyell's epic Principles of Geology. Geology is truly kind of a hot, I think it's okay. up and rising field at the time, tremendously exciting, the new insights into deep time and the nature of the past Earth. And of course, we know that Wallace read Darwin himself. He read Voyage of the Beagle, which by 1845 was really quite a bestseller. It came out in its second edition that year. And Wallace very much admired Darwin and his writings. So on the one hand, here with respect to scientific inspiration, there's a clear record of the sorts of things that Wallace is reading about. And he's interested, it's worth noting, and I'll say it again in a moment too, that he's interested not so much in simply the idea of traveling in the footsteps of luminaries like these and becoming a collector, but he's really interested in becoming what was called a philosophical naturalist. He's interested in the big philosophical questions of the day that the likes of Lyell and Humboldt and Darwin addressed. And those included not incidentally, questions like the nature of species, the origin of species. Now, these are not, of course, the only books that he's reading. And again, the other strain of his long life is that of social activism. And you also see the seeds of that interest planted very early on in the Mechanics Institutes. We know he comments specifically about his admiration for Thomas Paine, for example, the great American founding father, revolutionary, the Age of Reason. Of course, Robert Owen, he's a great admirer of Owen's. And then in an interesting way, there's one book in particular that really takes the kind of, scientific kind of philosophical ideas and then the kind of revolutionary, kind of real envelope pushing ideas and combines them. And that is this remarkable book called Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published in 1844, anonymously, turns out to have been published by Robert Chambers, a well-known author and publisher from Scotland. And probably with good reason, right? This tract was really denounced, at many a pulpit, denounced squarely by the scientific community as really a kind of rabble-rousing, evolutionary, trashy tract that really argued for revolutionary or evolutionary change in all things, from cosmological to the geological, and even ultimately down to the level of species and political institutions, which is really probably the one area that would have gotten him in the most trouble, talking about, the idea of political reform and perhaps even, political revolution at the time. So this is published anonymously, and it says something about Wallace and his penchant for really, always being willing to listen to fringe ideas, the ideas that most others would dismiss, and especially anything that might be considered rather scandalous, right? It says something that he read this book in 1845, a year after it came out, and was immediately convinced that the author was onto something. And specifically, what he latched onto was the idea about species change, what was called transmutation at that time, what we know as evolution today. And he's convinced of this, and it begins to really occupy an awful lot of his thoughts. Now, this happens to coincide with a year that he took off from surveying when he worked for 1 year, 1844, as a school teacher in the town of Leicester. And fatefully, fortuitously, in that year, he met a kindred spirit, a young guy about his own age, Henry Walter Bates. Bates would ultimately go on to his own kind of, to become a luminary in the history of evolutionary biology, sort of honored today, for example, with Batesian mimicry in butterflies and other organisms. But at the time, there were two kind of young guys. They were in their teens. Bates was an avid insect collector, something that Stuart and I can really appreciate, being, bug guys. Loved those insects and their diversity, the tremendous diversity that insects presented, turned Wallace onto the joys of insect collecting. And they spent quite a lot of time together until the end of that year when Wallace returned to surveying. And this is where we're very fortunate that, in a way, that they were physically separated, because they kept up their friendship and they're mutually informing each other of their interests and activities through letters, and the letters mostly survive, which is a wonderful thing. So here we have Bates a little bit older than he would have been at the time, of course. 1844 in Leicester, introduced to entomology. And we know that Wallace is really thinking about this idea about transmutation from a letter written to Bates, 9th of November, 1845, where he asks his friend, have you read Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, or is it out of your line, he says. And clearly, the letter Bates wrote back has not been found. That doesn't survive. But we can guess that whatever Bates said, Wallace was not pleased, because he then sort of berated his friend a bit. And this is a follow-up letter that Wallace wrote in December 1845, and this is just a bit of it. I'll quote here. And he says to his friend, I have a more favorable opinion of the Vestiges than you appear to have. I don't consider it a hasty generalization. You can tell that's what Bates must have said. But rather an ingenious hypothesis, strongly supported by striking facts. And he kind of goes on to say, this is what we need. We need to find these, we need to gather these facts. This is what will help us, better understand. So, you can sort of see the seed being planted of these, this idea of we need more facts to study this idea of transmutation. 2 years later, Wallace writes to Bates again. This is 1847, and he was dissatisfied, he said in this letter, with a mere local collection of insects. No, he wants to take some family, widely distributed, globally perhaps, and really study it thoroughly. And then very tellingly, in this letter, he uses these very words. Why does he want to study this one family thoroughly? Principally with a view to the theory of the origin of species, he says. So you can see he's very keen on this idea. And so the two of them are, really begin to think about this and think about what would be needed to bring facts to bear on the theory of the origin of species. Wallace says, by that means, I'm strongly of opinion some definite results might be arrived at. So amazingly, it was just months later that these two actually figured out a way to make their way to South America, to actually embark upon explorations of their own in the footsteps or in the spirit of, the great naturalists like Darwin, like Humboldt. And, specifically, they had a very capable agent in London. They would send specimens back to London. These would be sold to wealthy collectors and museums. Proceeds would be sent back to them in the field, and they would use those proceeds to keep funding their expeditions. And very tellingly, Wallace especially, but also Bates, they didn't sell everything they collected. He had, really, it was only the duplicates. He kept his own, he was amassing a personal collection that he would use to study this remarkable question. And so the two naturalists, now think about that. These two guys, very little formal education, no institutional connection, no new university, no museum, right? They have no funds. They have nothing, and yet they manage to make their way to South America, and they travel. Again, Wallace 4 years, Bates stayed 11 years in South America, making his name. Observations of diversity, geographical distribution, geology, the people, right? The ethnology is fascinating. I like to always make the point that Wallace did not travel in order to be a collector. He's sometimes mistaken as sort of, he's just a specimen collector. Oh, and he got lucky. He stumbled onto some great discoveries. No. There's a very clear record indicating that Wallace, he really aspired to be a philosophical naturalist and travel. Collecting was a means to an end of traveling to make observations, to collect specimens, to make observations on, and ultimately, audaciously, really thinking that they could weigh in on these grand philosophical questions. It was really pretty astounding when you think about their status at the time. And so here is the Great Rio Negro. Wallace penetrated to the very highest headwaters of the Rio Negro River, right to the area that Humboldt had actually reached, coming down from Venezuela, some half century before. Wallace, the surveyor, can't help himself but survey. And so this is actually just a piece of Wallace's hand-drawn map of the Rio Negro River. This was ultimately published by the Royal Geographical Society. And Wallace, everywhere he went, he's traveling largely by himself with local people to help him, learning their languages, making observations. He has his surveying equipment. He's literally surveying from canoe as he's going up these river systems. And this is an incredibly detailed map that really stood, after it was published by the Royal Geographical, for many, many decades, probably until the days of GPS. There was not a more accurate map of that region. Really quite a remarkable undertaking. And all the while we see Wallace making observations again of the people, like the great Moluccas of the indigenous people of the Wallaces River, and their artifacts, and great trees of the rainforest, and palms, a special interest in palms in relation to their geology. And then fish. He would often actually, fish, they don't keep their colors very long. When they would be caught, he would sketch them very quickly, and then they would get eaten. This was very, very common. These are a few of the drawings that survive from that trip, because actually this particular trip of Wallace's actually ended in disaster for him. And it kind of makes me think of another kind of line that Wallace often navigated, and that is, especially for that time and given where he is, right, that very tenuous line between life and death. And more than one occasion, racked by disease, by malaria and other diseases, beset by or threatened by pirates. We have in one instance coming face to face with a jaguar. We have maybe many cases where Wallace may very easily have lost his life on his expeditions. And as it happens, maybe one of the most perilous, one of the closest calls that he had with losing his life occurred as he was attempting to return home after 4 years in Amazonia. And here we are, 1852. Wallace has been way up the Rio Negro. And he comes back only to find that his youngest brother, who had come out to help him and decided it wasn't really, he couldn't really, he couldn't take the climate and the rigors of collecting. He decided to leave and head home, but never made it. His younger brother succumbed to yellow fever before he could leave Brazil. He also found many of his specimens kind of held up in the customs office. Routinely he would send material down that would get forwarded over to London. In this case, quite a lot of material is getting held up, and he had to sort all that out. He had loads of notebooks, he had loads of drawings, he had loads of specimens, he had a live menagerie, and he is ready to finally head home, 1852. And then this is what happens. Just a few weeks out, the ship burns at sea, and Wallace loses practically everything and almost his life. He and the crew are adrift for 10 days plus in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. And I thought I would just kind of read for you just a little bit how I sort of imagine this horrible event transpiring, right? This is from chapter 6. He slowly circled a towering funeral pyre that was his ship, an unspeakable calamity, the enormity of which had not yet registered. Nearly 4 weeks out from Belém, the weather fine and making good time, the captain caught a whiff of smoke one day after breakfast and asked Wallace to go investigate with him. The merchant vessel was carrying a large quantity of India rubber and balsam of Capivi, also known as copea balsam, an essential oil obtained from leguminous rainforest trees, then, as now, a prized ingredient in varnishes and ointments. Prone to combustion, kegs of copea balsam oil are most safely packed in damp sand. Captain Turner's first mistake was packing them in rice chaff. The heat of friction from the ship's incessant motion soon ignited the oil. in the already sweltering hold, but it may have slowly smoldered on in that airless space had not the captain made his second mistake. He and the mates foolishly fed the fire life-giving oxygen by opening hatches and cutting holes in the deck as they investigated the source of the smoke. In minutes, the fire roared to life, and by noon had gone from smolder to inferno, sending the crew scrambling to deploy the 2 lifeboats, longboats with sails and a smaller gig, neither much used and so riddled with gaps between planks, desiccated from years of baking in the tropical sun. The call came to abandon ship, and the crew was in a frenzy of activity. Wallace makes it down to the boat. He skins his hands badly as he slides down the rope. He has barely any time to grab just anything, something out of his cabin, and runs. And it happens to be a packet with those drawings that I just showed you, right? The few things that survived. Now Wallace and the crew watched, stunned from the comparative safety of the bobbing boats as the insatiable fire steadily consumed the ship. The shrouds and sails browned, then blackened, then burst into flame. The burning mainmast of the rolling ship snapped about 20 feet up, while the foremast, a pillar of flame, lasted an hour more. Flames leaped from the hatches. The decks were a mass of fire. The bulwarks broke off and fell flaming into the sea with a hiss. Most of his menagerie was dead by now. And they bailed all through the night. You know, it was quite the hellish scene as he described it. A huge cauldron of fire forming a liquid burning mass at the bottom. A fiery furnace tossing restlessly upon the ocean that surely, I think, recalled images very vivid from Dante's Inferno. So Wallace very easily could have lost his life in this episode. They were adrift for 10 or so days before the Jordison picked them up, and itself almost wrecked in the Channel before actually making it back to Britain. But it also says something about Wallace's innate sense of optimism, that this is one of the main things he could reflect upon by his time in the lifeboat. Well, what a great position to be in, to observe meteors, no better place than lying on your back, in a small lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic, fabulous skies. And that's Wallace, always sort of glasses half full, just very, and so despite this like tremendous setback, he's kind of, already just kind of looking ahead. Here we have Wallace very soon after his rescue, and he's nursed back to health. He's reunited with his mother and his sister in this photograph. And he comments that 50 times since he left Brazil has he vowed, if I once reached England, never to trust myself more on the ocean, he said. But of course, such vows are just, made to be broken. And maybe because he lost everything and he still sort of has this insatiable curiosity about this question about the origin of species, he embarks on this second voyage, this time heading east 18 months later, April 1854. He arrives in Singapore. And this is a period where his materials, his notebooks and other materials do survive, thank goodness. And I was especially interested, I was privileged to have an opportunity 10 years ago for the centennial of Wallace's death in 2013 to study this remarkable document that historians have dubbed the Species Notebook. This is not your ordinary field notebook. This is a field notebook. It is a working notebook with lots of memoranda and observations and records of collections, but it also has long narrative passages where Wallace is speculating on arguing for the reality of transmutation. And he actually reveals in this notebook his plans to write a book on the subject. It's fascinating. So in 2013, with the help of the wonderful Linnaean Society of London and my wife Leslie, who worked with me on the transcription, and Harvard University Press, my editors there, we published an annotated transcription of this fascinating notebook back in 2013. And it really reveals an awful lot about Wallace's remarkable travels. And I, of course, can't get into all of them and all of his discoveries here, but I'll sort of revisit a couple of these ideas of the lines that kind of define Wallace's interesting life. And one of those is, of course, the Wallace Line, which I mentioned earlier, the Wallace Line. Here, Wallace first was in the western part of this archipelago, and he was keen on exploring in the Far East to really kind of isolated locales like the Aru Islands and New Guinea. And you can't get anywhere directly. You have sort of a zigzagging, going from one port of call to another and kind of zigzagging your way across this great archipelago. And so in so doing, Wallace had come down and spent some time collecting on the island of Bali. And then after a short time, he crossed the narrow strait between Bali and the island of Lombok. You see Lombok here just to the east of Bali. And he had the presence of mind to kind of recognize that the avifauna, the mammalian fauna of the two islands were radically different, right? These are two islands that are otherwise nearly identical. They're about the same size. They're similar, small, volcanic, very rugged islands. They're side by side ecologically, environmentally, they're virtually identical. And yet what a mystery that they should have such radically different, this is not just a case of a few birds differing, but whole families are present in the one and then absent on the other, right? And then whole other families are occupying the other island. So this clued him into something very profound going on in these islands. And in the modern understanding, we can better understand the geographical distribution of this region, this interesting region, and how it's shaped by a number of processes, including deeper time tectonic processes, but also more recently, sea level fluctuation that's driven largely by glacial epochs. And Wallace didn't have, of course, any understanding of those sorts of phenomena, but he did understand that the geographical distribution of species in this archipelago does give you insight into Earth history. And he's the first really to recognize that you can understand biological and geological evolution as really as one, right? The Earth and life evolved together. And in that respect, we sort of honor Wallace, especially with some of his later writings on this subject, as the founder of modern evolutionary biogeography. So he first noticed this between Bali and Lombok, and then he began to really pay attention to the geographical distribution of these same families of mammals and birds and map out where they occurred. This was much later by T.H. Huxley, dubbed the Wallace Line, the great line of demarcation between the two of the six great sort of biogeographical realms of the planet. And I think of it as a kind of tracing in time and space. That's the way Wallace understood this, a tracing in time and space, running right down the center of this, these two regions, the Indo-Malayan and the Australasian, a region that now we further honor Wallace by referring rather broadly to as Wallacea. This is Wallacea. Very interesting. So this is one of Wallace's great discoveries in Southeast Asia, but another one was, of course, his quest to understand the origin of species. And I call this kind of breaking the species barrier, because bear in mind that although ideas about transmutation, about the evolution of species have been entertained by really more than a few naturalists for quite a long time, this was never taken seriously and never became mainstream scientific thinking. In fact, if anything, this was considered to be a rather, somewhat scandalous notion, really considered to be rather unphilosophical, and in its worst forms was considered to be almost seditious. Because of certain implications that it might have for the veracity of Scripture, for example, and the veracity of the church, right? So, so this was an idea that very few really took seriously. Now, unknown to Wallace, of course, one Charles Darwin is working on this independently and had already kind of cracked this interesting problem some 20 years before. Wallace is racked with malarial fever, as he recounts, in the village of Dodinka on the island of Halmahera. And as soon as he is well enough, and he relocates to his base on the neighboring small island of Ternate, he writes out his idea. And this is now called the Ternate Essay. And he writes what we would call a fair copy, a kind of a clean copy. And just as fate would have it, because he happened to be, for some time, in communication with Charles Darwin, and each of them had already shared with the other that their interest in this very general, interest in the nature of species and varieties, we see Wallace sending his essay to none other than Darwin, but it's also clear who his real object is. I mentioned that in the Species Notebook, Wallace is planning on writing a book arguing for transmutation. And we know exactly how that book would be structured because he wrote out narrative passages. His way of approaching this was to take Charles Lyell's anti-transmutation arguments in the Principles of Geology, write them out one after another, and then rebut them. So there are many, many pages of the notebook with narrative kind of rebuttals of Lyell's argument. This is why when Wallace sent his essay to Darwin, he knew that Charles Darwin and Charles Lyell were friends. In his cover letter, he said, if you think this has anything to it, please show it to Lyell, right? That's his real object is reaching Charles Lyell. Well, he had no idea what a bombshell this would prove to be. I mean, he didn't know that Darwin was actually working on this already for so long, right? And so, you know, there's a fascinating history here that I really won't get into in any detail, but it's quite interesting. I mentioned that he mailed his essay to Darwin probably about March of 1858 from Ternate. It was likely received by Darwin about mid-June of that year. There then ensued what has been called the delicate arrangement by Darwin's friends, Lyell himself, but also Joseph Hooker, the botanist, to read Wallace's essay at the Linnaean Society, but after reading unpublished excerpts of Darwin's own writings and, you know, clearly sort of seeking to sort of demonstrate and perhaps preserve their friend's priority in this matter. And indeed, you know, he had priority in the sense he truly had come to this idea a long time before and had done a remarkable amount of research. And so Darwin was now under pressure to produce Origin of Species, which he does about a year and a half later. On the Origin of Species is published November 1859. He sends a book quickly to Wallace, who's still in the field. And when Wallace receives his copy, he is elated, right? He is just really, he has nothing but the highest of praise for Darwin's achievement in that book. The force of admiration, he says, can no further go. And sadly, after this, he seems to have decided to shelve his own book plan. So I think that's a real pity. It might have been very interesting to see how he would have made these arguments. He returns in 1862, you know, quite a sort of scientific celebrity. He is the co-discoverer of the principle of natural selection, but his many other contributions, his collections, his papers on subjects like biogeography are recognized. Wallace recognizes, like everyone else does, the implications of the theory for humans. Right, something that Darwin shied away from addressing in the Origin, but we might say the gorilla in the room, right, is the implications for human evolution. This is the frontispiece to Huxley's book on the subject from 1863. Early on, Wallace is very much kind of on board with this idea. He too sort of understands natural selection has also acted on humans. And in fact, the very next year after Huxley's book, he publishes a remarkable paper, 1864. He argues in this paper to the Anthropological Society that selection has operated essentially in two phases in human evolution. He recognizes that humans have diverged from primate ancestors, but he argues that humans have only gotten so far in their physical differentiation when selection operating on the mind really becomes predominant, and that really we become almost freeze frame in terms of our physical evolution while our mental evolution continues. And it is our cognition that makes us truly remarkable organisms. So he has this kind of two-phase model that he shares. Darwin is amazed by this. Darwin writes to Wallace, "The great leading idea is quite new to me, that during late ages, the mind would have been modified more than the body." This was so impressive to Darwin that he incorporated it into The Descent of Man, Darwin's second most important book, published in 1871 on human evolution and also on sexual selection. And in chapter 7, he relates Wallace's model. This is very much the model that Darwin himself ends up adopting. So you can then imagine that just how, you know, flummoxed Darwin would be when suddenly, just a few years later, Wallace seemed to do an about face on this idea. And this is, I kind of think about this as Wallace having, erased this line, this long, long time where people had assumed that all species are immutable. They are created as we see them. They can never change. He broke through the species barrier. Species can change. But then when it came to humans, suddenly he's re-erecting that barrier. And it was just sort of deeply shocking, really, and disappointing to his friends. It's fair to say that this really maybe was the one episode that really strained his friendship with Darwin, but it never broke their friendship. They remained lifelong friends. So Wallace had become, starting about the mid-1860s, a spiritualist, right? Interested in the spiritualist movement, which held that there could be a kind of parallel plane of being somehow, and that perhaps certain gifted individuals, for whatever reason, might have the ability to communicate between this particular realm and that other realm. And he sort of had some very good arguments for this, that really, he argued that he was almost being more Darwinian than Darwin, because he was being very consistent in the application of logic about evolutionary gradualism. Specifically, he came to believe that the human brain couldn't evolve by very slow, gradual, stepwise evolution. Why is that? Because he said, for that to be true, you would expect there to be quite a hierarchy in mental capacities among perhaps different peoples of the world. Many people of Wallace and Darwin's time believed that that was true, right? It was rather, we could call it, elements of a nascent racism. It was, or maybe sort of ethno or Eurocentrism, where they believe that certain people had much greater cognitive capacities than other peoples. Wallace, no, that was not his belief. He actually believed that all peoples everywhere had exactly the same cognitive capacities, and they were prodigious capacities. And so he thought, if you have people who have lived and whose ancestors have lived since time immemorial in a so-called like primitive state, like hunter-gatherer societies, but they have mental capacities that are fully as capable as any European, well then, how do you have gradual evolution, right? So this is one of many arguments that he uses to sort of suggest that gradualism doesn't work, and it feeds into his nascent spiritualism, suggesting that there's another way to approach this. Well, you can just imagine how well this went over with Darwin. He's very, very upset. He says to Wallace, "I hope you've not murdered too completely your own and my child," he says. He's really, really upset. And then he even follows up with another letter. He reads more about what Wallace has to say about this. And he says, "As you expected, I differ grievously from you, and I'm very sorry for it." As I said, this was a serious strain in their relationship. It just seemed like, how could the co-discoverer of natural selection then chuck it when it came to humans? And because the general public and everyone else really thought, the most important thing was the implications for humanity, then this was just basically chucking over the whole thing, right? And he was just very, very upset with Wallace. And so we have what some authors have called a kind of a tale of two Wallaces, seemingly. I think that they're not so opposite as some may suggest. There's actually some complementarity to his scientific and sort of extra scientific interests. So here we have Wallace, on the one hand, the first Darwinian, right? He is a devastatingly effective defender of Darwin. He is as effective, truly, as Huxley, who's hailed as Darwin's bulldog. Even Huxley himself, who was a great friend of Wallace's, thought he's just remarkable in his ability to just skewer, and just the structure of his arguments and, skewering his opponents. Hundreds and hundreds of papers and letters. He's a very original theorist, right? Not only natural selection, not only his insights into evolutionary biogeography, but he originates this novel theory of the evolution of warning coloration, what we would call aposematic coloration, reinforcement and speciation. He disagrees with Darwin over the way sexual selection acts. And it's fair to say that the modern view of sexual selection by female choice, which is something of a kind of honest signaling idea where vivid coloration and vigorous courtship rituals, dances and things are signals of vigor and health. Probably the modern thinking is much closer to Wallace's views than to Darwin's views on that subject. quite an original thinker. 1869, his best-selling travel memoir, the Malay Archipelago, appears, a book that he dedicates to Darwin, who's deeply touched by this. He writes to Wallace, "This is a thing for my children's children to be proud of." He's just really touched, just remarkable. And yet this same Wallace is also the Wallace who is a tremendous thorn in the side of the establishment, scientific and otherwise. His advocacy for spiritualism it just endlessly puzzles his scientific colleagues. They can't understand because he can seem so gullible at times. In one memorable instance, there's a famous trial in London where a so-called medium, the Henry Slade trial, medium Slade was brought up on charges of defrauding the public. He was exposed as a fraud and caught in the middle of a seance. And so Darwin and company are actually contributing to the prosecution. And who should appear as the star witness for the defense? Wallace, So Darwin is like, what are you doing? He criticizes public support for natural history museums at a time when they're really trying to grow natural history museums. And then John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, invites Wallace to serve as the founding president of the Land Nationalization Society. And he, increasingly becomes more vocal and prolific in his output, arguing for justice in land reform and labor reform at that time. So in thinking about the Wallace of lines and borders and boundaries, I think about Wallace here, the humanitarian, who is assailing the poverty and discrimination line, very much painfully aware even of his own role in some measure of contributing to this. In 1888, Wallace actually, I think he'd always been really an Owenite socialist, but in 1888, he publicly declared himself a thorough socialist, he says. And he has very, very strong words like these: to allow one child to be born a millionaire and another a pauper is a crime against humanity, he says. And for those who believe in a deity, a crime against God, right? Really strong words from Wallace. He's deeply passionate about these social justice issues. This is a calling card from around this time, the mid-1890s, and I love that. He writes, "I'm wishing yourself in the cause of socialism every success," he says. Believe me, yours very truly, Alfred Russel Wallace. Very, very interesting. Towards the end of his life, he actually moved around quite a bit. He very peripatetic kind of life. He and his family. He had married Annie Mitten. They had 3 children, 2 of whom survived to adulthood. And here at the turn of the century, we have what I call the final frontier. And this is Wallace settled at Old Orchard in Broadstone. And here's a photograph of Wallace with his wife, Annie, and with their daughter, Violet, and their son, Will, may have been the photographer of this image. I don't know. And I wanted to give you a quick sense of just how, vibrant and endlessly interested in everything Wallace is, even at this age, right, at this point in his life. And I'll just read to you just a very short piece from chapter 14 here, because I find it really funny, pretty interesting. Because this was an episode where Violet is just really annoyed with her dad. Apparently she told him so. And so he had a response to that. So the chapter opens, "Violet was annoyed with her dad. He was a miserable correspondent," she berated, "her letters languishing for weeks unanswered." "Well, my dear Violet," he wrote in his defense, "if you had letters almost every day about Darwinism, spiritualism, vaccination, socialism, traveling, dog's tails, cat whiskers, glaciers, orchids, etc., and you had books sent to you on all these subjects to acknowledge and read and request for information on other subjects and other subjects and other subjects, and a book to write and a garden to attend to and 4 orchid houses and chess to play and visitors to see, calls to make, plants to name, and, etc., 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 perhaps you would be a miserable letter writer too." And then he says, "but perhaps also not." It was true enough. It was late 1896. He was busier than ever at nearly 74 years old. The sage of Dorset, his advice and opinion sought on all manner of subjects, many of which he said, I know nothing except general principles, and these go a long way with the ignorant. And yes, he was swamped, and he pleaded special dispensation from Violet, signing his letter off, your affectionate and much abused Pa. So that kind of gives you some sense of the kind of very warm relationship that the Wallace has with his family. Quite interesting. And so I want to sort of close here with this chapter of his life, this kind of last chapter of his life, and just leave with you this idea of the final frontier, perhaps, and Wallace as active as ever on both of these great fronts that he's so passionate about. On the one hand, pushing the envelope to the very end with respect to social justice and advocacy, right? In the year 1913, the year of his death, Wallace publishes The Revolt of Democracy and Social Environment and Moral Progress, for example. But then we also have evidence of the surviving handwritten manuscript, the outline for what would have been, I think, Wallace's last book. And this was to have been called Darwin and Wallace. He was to have written this with the help of James Marchand, who eventually was his biographer. And it's very interesting. This shows Wallace very much on his game to the very end, because the very last chapter, so this is 1913, and now multiple challenges to the Darwinian Wallacean model of evolution have been put forth. There was Neo-Lamarckism, there was the mutationists, the Darwinian school, the mutationism. There was Mendelianism, right? The very early Mendelianism was thought to actually undermine arguments of Wallacean Darwinian gradualism. And so here we see in his outline to what would have been chapter 8, he's ready to do battle, right? He says, no important difference among Darwinians, but mutationism and Mendelism, et cetera, totally inadequate. They only deal with side issues. You can just kind of tell where he's going to go with that argument. It's quite interesting. And this is this was to have been published with Murray, John Murray, the publisher, also who published Lyell and Darwin. And this was the card to be published in spring 1915. It was not to be, because he died sadly in November of 1913. But pushing the envelope to the very end. And I want to just begin to close here with some reflections. And I often kind of point to this passage from Gilbert Chesterton that I found fascinating when I first encountered it years ago. But I thought this is so interesting that Chesterton, writing in 1904, he says, if I were asked who ought to be regarded in future ages as the greatest man of our time, he says, I should hesitate between Walt Whitman and Alfred Russel Wallace. And I thought that's really remarkable. A juxtaposition, those two, Whitman and Wallace. And I'm sort of, an admirer of Whitman, kind of thinking about that. And I saw perhaps some connections between the two that I'm not sure that Chesterton necessarily had in mind. But this comes to mind, and I don't know that Wallace ever read it, right? From Whitman's Song of Myself in Leaves of Grass from 1855. And I thought this was quite interesting. Whitman writes, do I contradict myself? Well, very well then, I contradict myself, right? I am large, I contain multitudes. I thought, that's Wallace, I mean, clearly there are seemingly contradictory elements of his remarkable life and thought. And he is large indeed. He contains multitudes. He's truly astonishing, this individual. And so I'll just leave you with a brief final reading here, a reflection on that. And I'll return to the metaphor, really, of Wallace's line and Wallace's many lines. I hope I've kind of convinced you that there are many fascinating lines and borders and boundaries and frontiers that we can think of, literal and metaphorical, that make up Wallace's interesting life. So I write in the coda, the Wallace line is an apt metaphor for the many explorations of borderland and boundary we've seen crisscrossing Wallace's remarkable life. Biogeographical and geological, certainly, but there also exists the Wallace line of science and society, humans and nature, physical and spirit worlds, rich and poor, civilized and savage, privileged and powerless, Wallace's time and ours. Wallace was a thinker and role model for our times and beyond, for the ages, really. His life of curiosity, adventure, genius, discovery, and advocacy inspired and inspiring in equal measure. Like Walt Whitman, he contained multitudes with a largeness of spirit and a diversity of perspectives and experiences that embraced even self-contradiction at times. And that's okay. Like Whitman, too, Wallace beckons to us still from beyond some borderland of being. Metamorphosed in a way that Ovid would appreciate. And I'll quote Whitman here, "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love," he wrote. "If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You'll hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I'll be good health to you nonetheless and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you." So I closed this book by sort of reflecting on Whitman and Wallace and arguing that, we would indeed do well in this bicentennial year, this celebratory year of Wallace's birth, to keep searching for him, this kind of multitudinous, multifaceted, fascinating individual. Keep searching for him, certainly in the wide world that he loved, that he studied and taught us so much about, but also in thinking about his very deep well of curiosity, of generosity, right? Just, this ultimate magnanimous individual within ourselves, I think. He holds lessons for us at that level as well. And with that, I want to thank you all very, very much for your kind invitation and for your attention. I will just sort of point out here that that Whitman actually also looks an awful lot like one. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated. Yeah. And of course, happy to answer any questions.
I'd like to ask the question. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that, James. It was really it was fascinating talk. I know after the voyage of the Beagle, which was 5 years, and in that 5 years they only spent 34 days in the Galapagos. But it was when Darwin got back, and lots of his experiments were done at Down House, where he worked in his garden. He never sailed again. But was Wallace? Did he do was he similar in his sort of looking at his experimentation? Did he do much of it at home, or was it all in the field?
Yeah, it's a good question. They were rather different in their approach, and even Wallace admired Darwin's, this penchant for, what Darwin called experimentizing, right? Just endless, interesting little experiments. Wallace, for much of the time, I mean, he also didn't travel much after returning home. He did travel to North America later in the 1880s, had a year-long kind of tour, a lecture tour across North America, but no more travels of real exploration and discovery. Not an experimentalist in the same way that Darwin was. He did propose quite a few experiments, and some of these were carried out. For example, when he came up with the idea of warning coloration in insects like caterpillars, brightly, kind of contrasting colors, aposematic coloration, he suggested experiments in using birds, using an aviary, and looking at caterpillars that birds would attack, whether they tended to be brightly colored or not. And those experiments were conducted, and indeed, this became very much part of the understanding of the evolution of this form of coloration. Much later in life, there was kind of a movement towards better understanding the nature of inheritance and breeding, and the realization that this really needed to be done in a controlled way. And there was a movement, it didn't originate with Wallace, but a movement towards experimental farms, experimental stations to do controlled breeding experiments with plants and things. And he was very much an advocate of that. He supported this idea that we need more kind of boots on the ground and collecting data from doing these experiments. But it's curious that he didn't have much of a taste for doing these experiments himself. That's one interesting difference with Darwin, who just loved endlessly, getting into his meadows and garden and collecting pond mud and making all sorts of what he called fool's experiments to good effect. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to ask you an insect question. So you mentioned that when he settled out on his travels, he was interested in a family or group or something of insects. In the end, did his work on insects inform his theory particularly, or did it not lead to anything?
Yes. So another good question. And I think what happened with Wallace, so the short answer is yes, he did work on certain insects. He seemed to be pulled more and more in the direction of theory, of kind of big picture. And so he was so prolific in his collections, right? I mean, untold, tens of thousands of insect specimens, and that they really had to be farmed out. You needed specialists in this group or that group, and the beetles would go to one person, maybe the flies would go to another person. He did make a special study of swallowtail butterflies of the Malay archipelago. And in the mid-1860s, he published a very long paper. It was easily about 70 plus pages long. And this was interesting because it was both a kind of taxonomic systematic treatment describing species and their variants, but doing this in a geographical context, and then incidentally also addressing the principle of mimicry and trying to understand how different populations in different parts of the island were mimicking each other. So I think when Wallace did study a particular group like the swallowtails, it was with bigger theoretical questions in mind. And he was just overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of his material. So he let others actually do most of the species descriptions.
Yeah, as a matter of opinion, do you get the impression that Darwin was wasting time because he didn't actually want to go into print? Pouter pigeons, barnacles,
like delaying printing or publishing his theory.
I think he wanted to die before he actually went to press. And when he saw Wallace's analysis, he thought, I think Lyell and people like that were urging Darwin to go ahead and publish, which he did, but he knew it was going to cause a huge row, and he didn't really want that.
Yeah, so maybe Wallace forced his hand, you're suggesting, and he had to. So it's an interesting question, really. Why did it take Darwin, so long? I mean, he eventually was getting around to publishing in the mid-1850s, and admittedly, yes, at Lyell's urging. And it was Lyell really who noticed one of Wallace's significant papers from the Malay archipelago that got his attention and brought it to Darwin's attention as maybe something he should pay attention to, the Sarawak Law paper. Darwin, I think he knew very well the significance of his theory. And one very good bit of evidence for that would be in 1844, when Darwin had a fair copy of what's called now the Species Essay. It's essentially a long 200-page account of the theory, and it's kind of like a miniature version of Origin of Species. And but this was not for publication. This was sealed in an envelope with a letter to his wife that she should please publish it immediately in the event of his unexpected death. But as to whether he would really have rather not published at all, I don't know. He was very, very cautious. And, we made reference to the endless experiments, and he's constantly pulling together evidence to support his theory. He finally really did get around to beginning to put together the big species book, as he called it. His initial title was Natural Selection. It would have been just a tome, this enormous thing. And so my feeling is that he would have gotten around to it, but the product would have been almost infinitely less readable than The Origin of Species, which itself is not always an easy read. It's quite a long, but you know how in The Origin, Darwin is always apologizing that it's an abstract. This is a mere abstract of a much longer work. And it would have been a proper scientific treatise in the sense that it would have had endless supporting examples with references, right? Origin of Species has no references. I mean, it is a narrative argument. It's simply, as Darwin called it, one long argument, really. My gut feeling is that he would have published, but I think that he really did want it to be an absolutely ironclad argument. He did know that this was not a matter that would be taken lightly by his fellow naturalists, and I think he really wanted to cover himself there. And then in that respect, Wallace perhaps did force his hand, and we can maybe thank him for that he was forced to go into print with a much reduced, abbreviated version of his planned work, and that is on The Origin of Species, which is really just a fascinating argument. Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Wallace seems to be famous within his lifetime, but then rather fallen out in the public consciousness until fairly recently, when it's been suggested that Darwin stole his ideas, which doesn't seem to have been a fair record of it, but perhaps you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, Darwinian Wallacean, evolution by natural selection did kind of go into what historians and others have called a kind of eclipse in the early 20th century, only to emerge really after what is known as the modern synthesis, right, of the 1940s. And it does seem that in the process of rediscovering this idea, that mainly Darwin's name was sort of rediscovered and Wallace's contribution, was maybe not as fully appreciated at the time. And this probably did help contribute to a kind of neglect of Wallace in the 20th century until much later. There have been various writers, over the years that have suggested that Wallace was done wrong, that ideas were that he stole, Darwin stole ideas, and I don't see any evidence whatsoever for any of that. I do think that he suffered a kind of eclipse partly through his own doing, because Wallace, and this speaks to that deep generosity of spirit that he had from the very beginning. He's very deferential to Darwin, and it's not a class thing, because Wallace has plenty of examples where he does not hesitate to challenge someone who might be the great and the good, if he feels like he really is in the right and he has an argument. It's not that. So it's more that he genuinely feels like Darwin's achievement was just monumental, and he writes in private letters to his family even that Darwin's name will stand among that of the greatest philosophers for all time, and that sort of thing. It's really genuine. But then in the process, he not only decides to shelve his own book project, but he constantly is deferring to Darwin. Darwin now and then tries to sort of acknowledges that there is a co-discoverer, but fair enough, you can understand that he's very possessive of the theory. So Wallace's tendency to defer to him results in kind of, it makes it easy for Darwin to increasingly just kind of take credit, and that's kind of the way it's seen. And even when Wallace came out with his own book, he wrote it as a kind of updated version, as he saw it, of Origin of Species. His book in 1889 on the subject, he called it Darwinism. And he's always sort of deferring. And I think that it reinforced the sort of this misunderstanding about his own role. And it did tend to lead to people, especially in later years, rediscovering these ideas, just handing the laurels mainly to Darwin and neglecting Wallace. So it's nice to see that in more recent years, especially since 2013, the centennial of Wallace's death, there's really been a wonderful resurgence in scholarship. The Wallace Correspondence Project has come online since, and so many of his letters are now freely available through Epsilon, through Cambridge University Library, thanks to the Correspondence Project. A great many new manuscripts, notebooks have been fully scanned and now made available to the scholarly community by organizations like the Linnaean Society, for example. So I think there's been a real renaissance in understanding about Wallace's contribution and correcting this misapprehension that he was simply a collector who was in the right place at the right time, or got lucky and stumbled onto this idea of natural selection. I think that's quite incorrect. And the evidence is very clear what he was about, right? And how he was going about this. And so in my own sort of scholarly work, and I've written a fair bit about Darwin and Wallace, and I find them both, you know, just remarkable thinkers. And in this bicentennial year, this book, Radical by Nature, was my effort to really help bring Wallace to a broader readership and better understand this person as a person, as well as a thinker. I think with more and more efforts like this, I think that this is having a corrective effect going forward.
There's a couple of quick questions online. First of all, do you know precisely why Wallace was against the expansion of public access to natural history museums? It seems a striking contradiction with his political beliefs, and that's from Philip Allen.
Yeah, so good question. There's sort of a whole interesting story there, but I guess in a nutshell, so yeah, why would Wallace be opposed to natural history museums? Oh, well, that's his bread and butter, you know. Well, actually, this maybe says something about Wallace. He's curious, his sense of fairness and justice, that he argues. I don't know that he like held onto this view forever, but he published some letters to this effect, and he argued that it's not really right, you know, to use public funds to support an institution that is really sort of the darling of, let's use a modern term, like a few nerds like me, you know, that it's really like, you know, the handful of collectors, you know, collector naturalists, of course, very, very important to get to obtain these specimens. But should the public be footing the bill for these great expeditions? And so he actually argued no. He thought it wasn't fair. He thought that museums were valuable, certainly, but that they should have a sort of a didactic element. They should be instructive. And so museums and their exhibits, they should be presenting materials and exhibits and such to edify the visiting public and not be, you know, sort of, you know, just simply supporting the obscure interests of a handful of zoologists and botanists, that sort of thing.
Thank you. We have rather similar arguments currently about arts funding for the Royal Opera House, I think. So that kind of thing continues to go. The final question is from Julie Bissett, an artist, who says, where's the best place to see his collected specimens from an artistic point of view?
From an artistic point of view. Well, the Natural History Museum in Oxford, the University Museum there, has probably the single largest collection of Wallace's insects, and there are some truly spectacular insects from an artistic point of view. I mean, so many of them are beautiful, as we know, but including really monumental specimens like Wallace's giant bee. the Natural History Museum in London. Now, not all of these are simply just on display, but I think that for an artist or a scholar, a writer, a historian, it is possible to contact the curators and make arrangements to see these specimens. There are a number of beautiful birds in the collection at Tring. Of course, some of those you may know were destroyed, sadly. But I think by special arrangement, it is possible to see this precious material collected by Wallace at a number of these institutions. The Linnaean Society, I believe, has some specimens. But I think my go-to for seeing many specimens of Wallace's would be the Natural History Museum in Oxford and the Natural History Museum in London.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
And there is Stuart.
All right, thank you, Stuart.
Well, I think that we've been really privileged this evening to learn a lot about a person who clearly was incredibly important in the development of our present understanding of the natural world, and who has really been, I think, underappreciated for a very long time. So thanks very much, James, for that. Personally, what I'm going to take away this evening is your astonishing comparison between the two men with the beards. I had not thought of Walt Whitman and Alfred Russel Wallace in the same bracket before, but I certainly am going to think of it that way now. And for those of you who are just the right age, which basically means my age, actually there's another person who comes to mind in exactly the same way, who's Bob Dylan, who actually, like Wallace, is a very quick thinker. Rather famously, he claimed that all of his songs would have been written in about 10 minutes, and who tackled a vast range of different kinds of work, and who also claimed that he contained multitudes, thereby reminding us that he had read Walt Whitman. And Bob Dylan, I think, is also a very spunky sort of character, inclined to go around annoying people, and maybe just like Alfred Russel Wallace in the same way. So thank you so much. I'm going to ask everybody to join me in appreciating your talk in the usual way.